Welcome back to the class, and we are starting the discussion on modernity and globalization, and we already started that discussion in the previous class. We started the fourth week of this course, and the week 4 and week 5 are dedicated to discuss the central theme related to globalization and modernity or postmodernity kind of a debate. So in the previous class, I think we had a slightly extensive discussion on what is meant by modernity and how is that there is not much of a consensus among social theorists regarding the characterization of our current stage. I mentioned you that there are a large number of scholars who characterize our contemporary society as postmodernity, whereas a lot of other scholars, mostly from the discipline of sociology, who do not quite agree with that kind of a characterization, and because they are not ready to abandon this whole concept of modernity. So then it becomes then quite interesting to see that how this whole process of globalization is being discussed and debated within these competing frameworks of modernity as well as late modernity. Okay, so there are a substantial section of sociological thinkers and theorists, including Anthony Giddens and David Harvey and Ulrich Beck, who argue that what we are seeing today as a form of globalization is a radicalized form of modernity. So they use other terms like reflexive modernization, reflexive modernity, or late modernity, or for example, Sigmund Bauman uses the term liquid modernity to describe a global scenario of the contemporary times. So we had that discussion in the previous class, try to understand what were the initial assumptions of modernity and how modernity represented a break from the tradition, and how it spoke in the language of universalisms, and how it had a very unbridled kind of optimism about the power of rationality, scientific thinking, and a particularly defined notion of progress. And we also saw the kind of a crisis that it brought in, especially in the second half of 20th century, with world wars and then the genocide in Germany. So we know that whatever is kind of promised did not come true, and then the whole debate whether from 1970s onwards are we witnessing a kind of a completely different social order, completely different ontological changes which can no longer be explained on the basis of modernity, other thing. So one of the most important scholars in this entire debate is Anthony Giddens, and Anthony Giddens is a British sociologist, a person of very high eminence. And it is not only that he was a sociologist, he was an important advisor, he was a public intellectual, he was an advisor to British government, an extremely influential scholar, Anthony Giddens. His theorization on third wave politics, his theorization on structuration theory are all extremely important. So I want to introduce you to this book, that is Consequences of Modernity, okay, in which he theorizes this process of globalization by firmly keeping it within the framework of modernity. Okay, he argues that modernity has changed significantly. Okay, there is a break, and modernity has been radicalized. Okay, or second modernity or first modernity, something that we discussed in the previous classes. So but nevertheless, he anchors this whole discussion and debate about globalization firmly within the framework of modernity. He is not ready to abandon the framework of modernity. He is not ready to overthrow to the whole let go the framework of modernity. He is not an admirer of the postmodern theorization. Rather, he thinks that the arguments of modernity or the frameworks of modernity are highly relevant, albeit in a highly transformed kind of a scenario or situation. So we will be spending quite a lot of time on this book, and this book is really available in the internet, and I strongly urge you to read. It has some 4 or 5 chapters, and the introductory chapter is a kind of summary of most of these arguments. So we will go in detail. I might take maybe 2 or 3 sessions to discuss some of these chapters. Some chapters I might go much detail, while other chapters I might not go in that detail. So we are starting this discussion on of Anthony Giddens' book, The Consequences of Modernity. So let us again not depend on PowerPoint. Let us straight away go to the text. This is the book, The Consequences of Modernity, Anthony Giddens, published some 30 years back, published in 1990, and but still considered to be extremely important work. And why I am using this work? Because it really gives a lot of clarity to some of the very foundational ideas of modernity. Okay, it's written in a very accessible language, and quite a lot of terms that became integral part of globalization discussions and debates. For example, time space distanciation, deterritorialization, symbolic tokens, and these terms are kind of elaborated and discussed in this particular book. So I felt that you need to have a firm footing on this particular text. So it has first chapter, the introduction, discontinuities. So we will be discussing this first chapter where he summarizes most of these important arguments in detail, and also we'll go through the second chapter, and other chapters we might not go that detail, because many of these ideas are already been summed up in this first introductory chapter. And there is a fourth chapter which is on trust basically, and this is a very interesting chapter where he talks about how globalization brings in completely different types of dynamics to our own personal subjectivity. Okay, how we look at ourselves, how we establish relationship with others, how we, for example, even falling in love. He says that in the era of modernization, in the era of globalization, is an extremely conscious act. You will have to really open up. You will have to really, you can't really assume that the other person can assume a lot of things about you. This mutual assumptions becomes extremely problematic. You will have to really open up you deliberately. You need to really expose you deliberately, explaining what your ideas are, your intentions are, your inclinations are, your various positions are. So nothing can be granted in this whole situation. So and then it ends with a very interesting section on Is Modernity a Western Project? Concluding observations. Maybe we can spend some time on that as well. Yeah, so we are beginning this first chapter, introduction, and as I mentioned, in this first chapter he summarizes quite a lot of arguments of this whole book, including a series of concepts that he introduced and his overall argument. So we will go slow on this chapter, explaining most of the significant paragraphs. So as I mentioned, this is an extremely important work because it clarifies a lot of very basic terms and concepts and categories, so that you get better clarity on these terms. So now what follows, I develop an institutional analysis of modernity with cultural and epistemological overtones. In so doing, I differ substantially from the most current discussions in which these emphases are reversed. What is modernity? The first approximation, let us simply say the following. Modernity refers to modes of social life or organizations which emerged in Europe from the 17th century onwards and which subsequently became more or less worldwide in their influence. This is something that we have been talking about, and the process of colonization played a very important role in that. This associates modernity with time period and with an initial geographical location, but for the moment leaves the major characteristics safely stored away in a black box. So this is something, it has a very spatial aspect. It emerged in the Western Europe, it did not emerge anywhere else, and it also emerged in a very specific historical period. It did not emerge in the medieval period, it did not emerge in the ancient period, rather it emerged in a very specific historic period, maybe between say 18th and 20th century or 19th century. So now today, the late 20th century, it is argued by many we stand at an opening of new era to which the social sciences must respond and which takes us beyond modernity itself. This is what I am talking about, the arguments of the postmodernist. A dazzling variety of terms have been suggested to refer to this transition, a few of which refer positively to the emergence of new types of social system, such as information society or consumer society, which we will discuss later. But most of which suggest rather that a preceding state of affairs is drawing to a close. Post-modernity, post-modernism, post-industrial society, post-capitalism, and so forth. So as I mentioned, Giddens does not belong to this category. He takes issues with this particular kind of an argument. For example, he brings in Lyotard, a very important theoretician of postmodernity, who really defines it in a very beautiful way, and he invokes Lyotard. As he presents it, postmodernity refers to a shift from attempts to ground epistemology and from faith in humanly engineered progress. This condition of postmodernity is distinguished by an evaporating of the grand narratives, the overarching storyline by means of which we are placed in history as being having a definite past and a predictable future. The postmodern outlook sees a plurality of heterogeneous claims to knowledge in which science does not have a privileged position. So this is one of the important features of postmodernity, okay, in which they argue that the grand narrative of modernity, okay, in which science had a central role, rationality had a central role, and there was an overarching language of progress as that's going to be the only way forward. So that kind of a era of grand narrative of a particular understanding of history, that is over as per Lyotard, and rather we will have to see a kind of a bewildering era, bewildering array of pluralities, and the world will move without any kind of particular direction. You will not have a singular overarching idea. You will not have a singular overarching idea about what is good, what is bad, and the science will lose its significance as the major narrative. Science will be relegated to one among the multiple narratives that you will ascribe to, and this is an extremely important claim. Okay, so this claims of postmodernity is a very far-reaching claim. It's an overarching claim, and it's too ambitious a claim as well. So now he argues that this becomes difficult. The kind of an argument that Lyotard put forward are quite ambitious, and as I mentioned, Giddens does not agree with that. So what he does instead, we have to look at again at the nature of modernity itself, okay, rather than throwing it away, rather than abandoning it. We need to look at the nature of modernity itself for certain fairly specific reasons has become poorly grasped in social sciences hitherto. Rather than entering a period of postmodernity, we are moving into one in which the consequences of modernity are becoming more radicalized and universalized than before. And this is the most important point that a series of scholars, including Beck, including Bowman, including Harvey, and including Giddens, really argue about. That the consequences of modernity has now taken the center stage. And among these consequences, there are things that we anticipated, we wanted, and also there are consequences which we never anticipated, which we never intended. Okay, so we are in a scenario where both anticipated, intended, as well as unanticipated and unintended consequences are now kind of ruling the roost. Okay, they are becoming the most dominant players, and that is taking its own course. Okay, so the consequences of modernity, the modernity has radicalized. The modernity has radicalized. It's not that modernity has diminished or modernity has become insignificant. Rather, the consequences of modernity has become so radicalized. It has become so unpredictable. It has simply gone beyond our hands. Okay, the other book of Giddens which we are going to discuss is titled The Runaway World. Okay, so he is characterizing the world as a runaway world with its own intention. We have no way of controlling it. We have no way of reining it. Okay, the kind of optimism that we had, that with the help of science we are able to control the nature, we are able to dominate the nature, that simply does not hold any water. Okay, so rather than entering a period of postmodernity, we are moving into one in which the consequences of modernity are becoming more radicalized and universalized than before. Beyond modernity, I shall claim we can perceive the contours of a new and different order, which is postmodern. But this is quite distinct from what is at the moment called many as postmodernity. So this view I shall develop have the point of origin in what I elsewhere called as a discontinuous interpretation of modernity of modern social development, by which I mean that modern social institutions are in some respect unique, distinct from all types of traditional order. Okay, capturing the nature of this continuities involved, I shall argue, is the necessary preliminary to analyze what modernity actually is, as well as diagnosing its consequences up to the present day. So what Giddens does is that he reanalyzes the basic features of modernity and tells that how what we are seeing in contemporary world is actually manifestations of the same similar kind of basic principles. So he talks about the discontinuities of modernity. Okay, how did modernity really represent a discontinuity from the past? Why do we consider modernity as a point of a rupture? Why do we consider modernity as a point of a new era? Okay, so the idea of human history is marked certain discontinuities. Okay, and does not have the smoothly developing form. It of course is a familiar one and has been stressed in most versions of Marxism. So if you look into the whole question of discontinuity and change, there are arguments about, say, unilinear evolutionary models. Okay, society moving from one direction to the another, and there are different scholars who have used different kind of categories. For example, Auguste Comte talked about movement from a theological to metaphysical to positive stage, and according to Auguste Comte, the Western Europe has already reached the positive stage where science is the most dominant paradigm, and all other countries, all other societies will follow the suit. And Karl Marx also had such kind of an evolutionary model, but it's not the story of an evolutionary model, but as you know, he presented it through the story of dialectical materialism, how conflicts happen when there is a fundamental conflict take place in the realm of forces, in the realm of production. When there is a conflict happens between the forces of production and relations of production, how that leads to a completely new economic order, which again has this kind of a contradictory dialectical powers, which again leads to this kind of a crisis, conflict. And so he has that kind of a evolutionary model, but presented as a dialectical method or dialectical historicism. Now, Giddens is not a Marxist in that sense. Giddens does not subscribe to that Marxian analysis of social change. The modes of life brought into being the modernity has swept us away from all traditional types of social order in quite unprecedented fashion. So, if you look at the span of society, for example, he says, but the changes occurring over the past 3 or 4 centuries, okay, a tiny period of historical time, have been so dramatic and so comprehensive in their impact that we get only limited assistance from our knowledge of the prior periods of transition in trying to interpret them. So if you look at the last 3 or 4 centuries, okay, starting from, say, 17th century, okay, 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th century, this 4 centuries are such a tiny fraction if you look at the evolution of human history, okay, maybe from the past 10,000 years or 7,000 years. These 4 or 5 centuries are a tiny fraction. But the impact and the influence of these 4 centuries is something so drastically high. It's something so comprehensive. Okay, it's something so deep in its magnitude. It's so vast that we don't have anything that is similar to that in any part in human history. Okay, so now what are the kind of changes that modernity has brought in? So Giddens brings in this kind of very specificities of the kind of changes that modernity brought in. One is, there are several features include. One is the pace of change which the era of modernity sets into motion. The kind of speed with which society underwent change. Okay, and the pace increased dramatically in this period of modernity compared to that of the pre-modern period. The pace of change in every aspect of society. Okay, pace of change in terms of technology, pace of change in terms of energy sources, in terms of production, in terms of political changes, in terms of religious beliefs or the laws of religious belief. So you don't have any other period in human history which can be comparable with the kind of pace of change that have witnessed during this period of the emergence of modernity. And the second discontinuity is the scope of change. Okay, as we discussed, this rise of modernity left no areas untouched. There's no area which is uninfluenced by the tide of modernity, starting from our most personal and private aspects of life to that of the most universal global aspects have been tremendously impacted by forces of modernity. And the third feature concerning is the intrinsic nature of modern institutions. Okay, modern institutions have brought in fundamental changes. Modern judicial system, modern nation state, modern bureaucracy, okay, modern educational institutions. Okay. So modern political institutions, political party systems. So all these modern institutions have tremendously transformed the kind of social setting that we were familiar with. In pursuing my inquiry into the character of modernity, I want to concentrate on a substantial portion of the discussion upon themes of security versus danger and trust versus risk. So he's introducing this very important category called as security and danger, trust and risk, in order to continue with discussion on this period of modernity. And we will come back to this concept of risk, especially we will discuss in detail Ulrich Beck's arguments about risk. He characterizes this contemporary modern society as a risk society. Okay, so there are very fascinating theorizations about what does risk mean in a global society, in a late modern society, and how do we respond, and how our responses are restricted. So all these things are something very, very important. In pursuing my inquiry into the character of modernity, I want to concentrate a substantial portion of the discussion upon the themes of security versus danger and trust versus risk. Okay. Modernity, as everyone living in the closing years of the 20th century can see, is a double-edged phenomenon. The development of modern social institutions and their worldwide spread have created vastly greater opportunities for human beings to enjoy a secure and rewarding existence than any type of pre-modern society. But modernity also has a somber side, which has become very apparent in the present century. On the whole, the opportunity side of modernity was stressed most strongly by the classical founders of sociology. Marx, Durkheim both saw the modern era as a troubled one. We had some discussion about it in the previous class. But each believed that the beneficent possibilities opened up by the modern era outweighed its negative characteristics. Marx saw class struggle as the source of fundamental schisms in the capitalist order, but at the same time envisaged the emergence of a more humane social system. We discussed this thing in detail when I offered a course on classical sociological theory. So in that course we had elaborate discussions about the positions of Marx, Durkheim and Weber towards the whole question of modernity. Of course, they were all the champions of modernity. At the same time, they were also the bitter critics of modernity. Okay. At the same time, none of them wanted to abandon or none of them wanted to condemn the process of modernity. While they acknowledged that it could be violent, it could be it may have quite a lot of negative things, they all very strongly believe that it is definitely a qualitatively better step in comparison with the previously existing modes of social organization. So Durkheim believed that the further expansion of industrialism would establish a harmonious and fulfilling social life integrated through combination of the division of labor and moral individualism. Max Weber was the most pessimistic among the three founding fathers, and we saw that when he talks about the tyranny of instrumental rationality. Okay, he argued that modernity is going to be the era of rationality, but he was very skeptical that overemphasize a monopoly of instrumental rationality will lead to a very dry and violent kind of a social order. Okay, so this again the discussion on Marx and Durkheim, which I am not going into detail. Now, social thinkers writing in the late 20th and early 20th century could not have foreseen the invention of nuclear weaponry. But the connecting industrial innovation and organization of military power is a process that dates back to the early origins of modern industrialization itself. Not just the threat of nuclear confrontation, but the actuality of military conflict from a basic part of the dark side of modernity is the current century. The 20th century is the century of war, with the number of serious things. So this whole idea that modernity brings in a completely different dimension to the question of risk and trust. That's what Giddens is going to explain in the coming section. Because at the time of modernity, the spokespersons of modernity promised you that you will be able to lead a far better and secured life. Why secured life? Because science and technology will ensure that we have conquered the nature. We don't have to really worry about nature. The fury of the nature. You don't have to worry about, say, floods or lightning or drought or lack of food, because science and technology will be there to protect you. And we even believed that human beings are able to establish their master over the nature. Nature was seen as something that needs to be conquered. Nature was seen as something that needs to be exploited. So man was seen as the quintessential center of this whole state of affairs. Now, sitting today, sitting in this late modern period, we think that our sense of that kind of a security is very fragile. Okay, we may not be too worried about the natural calamities anymore, but we are constantly worried about the risk factors that we have brought upon ourselves. We are worried about nuclear arms. We are worried about environmental degradation. We are worried about pollution. We are worried about terrorism. We are worried about internet scams that can rob you of all your wealth in no matter of time. So our sense of security has been very significantly challenged and damaged. So that is a very, very interesting dimension that Giddens wants to discuss, and we will come back to this theme when we discuss Ulrich Beck as well. Then there is some discussion about sociology and modernity, which again I feel is something very important. Sociology, as I mentioned, Giddens defined sociology as the study of modernity. You remember I started last class with that particular slide. The first concerns of institutional diagnosis of modernity. The second has to do with the prime focus of sociological analysis, that society. The third relates to the connection between sociological knowledge and the characteristics of modernity to which such knowledge refers to. So we discussed these points in the previous class when we talked about how sociology looks at modernity as its very, very basic subject matter. All these authors, Marx, Durkheim and Weber, for authors influenced by Marx, the major transformative force shaping the modern world is capitalism. With the decline of feudalism, agrarian production based on the social manner is replaced by production of markets of national and international scope, in terms of which not only an indicative variety of material goods but also human labor power became commodified. We are again going back to this classical thinkers' ideas about modernity and how society undergoes change. And now this a kind of an economic deterministic viewpoint of Marx. When I say economic deterministic viewpoint of Marx, there are a lot of debate among the academics whether did really Marx propound an economic deterministic view. Scholars argue that Marx never wanted to reduce everything to economics, but he wanted to give primacy to that of the economic front. Now, Weber and Marx differed with Marx very vehemently. We know the kind of debate of Weber's debate with the ghost of Marx about the nature of capitalism, about the nature of religion, about the nature of social stratification and so on. So for Durkheim as well, capitalist competition is not the central element of the emergence of industrial order, and some of the characteristics upon which Marx laid great stress he saw as marginal and transitionary. So then Weber spoke of capitalism rather than the existence of an industrial order. But in some key respects, this view is closer to Durkheim than to Marx. Rational capitalism, as Weber characterizes it, comprises of the economic mechanism specified by Marx, including commodification of wage labor. Now, the question is, do we now live in a capitalist order? Okay, because capitalism is something so central to that of modernity. So when we say that we have said goodbye to modernity and we have entered into post-modernity, what happened to some of its very constituent elements? What happened to capitalism? Are we seeing in an era which is not capitalist anymore? You know that even late capitalism is capitalist. Neoliberal capitalism is still capitalist. So this is the question that Giddens wants to raise again and again. So do we now live in a capitalist order? Is industrialism the dominant force shaping institutions of modernity? Should we rather look to rationalized control of information as the chief underlying characteristics? Can we say that the prime mover of economy has been shifted from that of industry into that of information? Is this characterization right? Can we say that the global economy is now driven by information, not on industrial production? Is it too much of a statement? Okay. Is it that we are going overboard, or is it something important? Is it something real? I shall argue that these questions cannot be answered in this forum. That is to say, we should not regard these as mutually exclusive characterization. Modernity, I propose, is multidimensional level of institutions, and each of these elements specified by these various traditions play some part. And any analysis of the global economy would argue that the industrial production is still something extremely important, and it's not a very productive line of argument to say that the informationalism and industrialism are completely mutually exclusive and then opposite. Then he talks about society. We know that sociology is the study of society. A conception of society emerged along with modernity, and as I mentioned in the previous class, this conception of society was not seen as society is no longer a residue. Society is no longer an epiphenomenon of some other phenomenon. Okay, you can't reduce society to that of the economic or political or cultural aspect. Society, the social, emerged as an independent realm. Now, what is the kind of change? And that is why how sociology emerged as a modern social science. Sociology emerged as a science which wanted to study this social. Now, what kind of transformations have happened in the realm of this social in this late modern period? Now, why should we have reservations about the notion of society as ordinarily used in sociological thought? And this is a point which again, raised by scholars like Ulrich Beck. When Ulrich Beck spoke about the transition from change from methodological nationalism to methodological cosmopolitanism, he is saying exactly the same. Even where they do not explicitly say so, authors who regard sociology as a study of societies have in mind societies associated with modernity. In conceptualizing them, they think of quite clearly delimited systems which have their own inner unity. Now, understood in this way, societies are plainly nation states. I gave you the examples that Indian society was seen as society within the nation state of India. Indian economy was seen as the economy that is clearly within the boundaries of Indian nation state. Yet another sociologists speak of a particular society might casually employ instead of the term nation or society. The character of the nation state is rarely directly theorized. So this was a conventional view that we began to look at society in that way, but as we know, that is no longer true. Okay, the Indian society now is not something like as if it is in a container, okay, insulated from other forces. Now we know that the kind of how Indian society is being exposed to the kind of transnational flows and influences, and in a state of fluidity. So I do not think it is useful to think of social systems in such a way as something that is bounded within nation state. We should reformulate questions of order as a problem of how to become that social system, because he talks about Talcott Parsons, and Talcott Parsons, like any other structural functionalist, were really preoccupied with the whole question of stability. Okay, and this is no longer the concern of sociology anymore. So the problem of order is here seen as one of the time-space distanciation, and this is yet another very important theorization of Giddens, which we will discuss in the sixth week, where we talk about this whole dimension between time and space. We bring in Saskia Sassen, we bring in Manuel Castells, we bring in David Harvey, we bring in Anthony Giddens as well. How did they re-theorize this relation between time and space? So Giddens' argument is about time-space distanciation. Okay, the conditions under which time and space are organized so as to connect presence and absence. This issue has been conceptually distinguished from that of the boundedness of social systems. Modern nation states, in some respects, at any rate, have a clearly defined boundedness, and we need to reconsider that. Okay, in conditions of modernity, the level of time-space distanciation is much greater than even in the most developed agrarian civilizations. Okay, time-space distanciation, for example, in a non-modern society, if a social action has to take place, the action takes place in a particular given time, in a particular given place. Okay, they are coterminous. An action takes place in a given geographic region, given geographic place. The placeness is important. Okay, but whereas in a modern era, you are able to coordinate your action even in far off places. Okay, with the help of telecommunication. Okay, by using telephone or a telegram, other thing, you are able to influence the action in far off places. That means you don't need to be there physically in that particular place, rather, but you are able to coordinate actions. In a late modern era, in the contemporary era of globalization, okay, this relation between place and time is completely distanced. That's what Giddens argues when he talks about time-space distanciation. Okay, there is no the time and the space understood as a kind of a place is completely disengaged, disentangled. Now, sitting in one part of the globe, you are able to control actions across the globe, and that's how the multinational companies or major media firms or every other such kind of things really function. So we will come back to that point later. Yeah. So then he talks about another important feature is the relationship between sociology and its subject matter. The actions of human beings in conditions of modernity has to be understood instead of terms of in terms of the double hermeneutics. The development of sociological knowledge is parasitical upon lay agents concept. On the other hand, notions coined in the meta languages of social sciences routinely re-enter universe of actions of actions. These were intricately formulated to describe or account for, but it does not lead in a direct way to a transparent social world. Sociological knowledge spirals in and out of the universe of social life, reconstructing the social life. So what does he talk about here about this double hermeneutics? He says he points at the kind of a relationship between sociological knowledge and the society. Okay, you know that the sociology is the field of study which analyzes society, and it creates quite a lot of knowledge. And what he argues is that this knowledge goes back to the society and reformulates the social practices there. So there is a kind of a double hermeneutics, there is a kind of a dialectical relationship between sociological knowledge and the society that it studies. Okay, so sociology derives knowledge from the society, and the society also derives sociological concepts and knowledge, and thereby changes itself. And this is an extremely important point. You look at the case of, say, how our understanding about sexuality underwent drastic changes in the recent past. The social science understanding about sexuality, the terms that are coined, transgender, queer, and alternate sexuality, all these terms are now getting circulated in the commonsensical parlance, in the everyday transactions of the ordinary society, thereby changing their discourses and practices. So that's what he's talking about as a kind of double hermeneutics, both itself and the universe as an integral part of that process. If we were adequately to grasp the nature of modernity, I want to argue we have to break away from the existing sociological perspective in each of these respects mentioned. We have to account for the extreme dynamism of the globalizing scope of modern institutions and explain the nature of their discontinuities from the traditional society. I shall come to a characterization of these institutions later. First of all, posing for the question, what are the sources of the dynamic nature of modernity? Several set of elements can be distinguished in formulating an answer, each of which is relevant both to the dynamics and to the world embrace. The dynamics of modernity derives from the separation of time and space and their recombination in forms of which permits the precise time-space zoning of social life with the disembedding of social systems, a phenomenon which connects and the reflexive ordering and reordering of social relations in the light of continual inputs of knowledge. So this is what he is going to discuss in this coming section. So we will stop here, but just to have a brief recap, he is arguing that modernity really represents a break from the past, because it brought in a series of institutions, and just like modernity brought in a fundamental break from tradition, this era of globalization is also bringing in another moment of discontinuity. And in order to understand this discontinuity is not to completely abandon the framework of modernity, but to understand how some of the basic elements of modernity themselves are undergoing significant transformations. Okay, so we will continue with this discussion of this particular chapter, this introductory chapter, in the next class. Okay, thank you.